Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Department of Conservation's Wild Webcast on Attracting Backyard Wildlife. I'm Joe Jarrett with the department's Outreach and Education Division, and I'll be hosting today's Wild Webcast. Let's give a warm welcome to our topic experts on attracting backyard wildlife. We have MDC Habitat Management Coordinator Nate Muenks with our Wildlife Division. We have the City of Columbia Community Conservationist Danielle, and we have MDC State Ornithologist Sarah Kendrick, also with our Wildlife Division. And welcome, Nate, Danielle, and Sarah.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Joe.
Let's get to know them a bit more. Nate earned his Bachelor of Science degree in biology with an emphasis in wildlife from the Missouri State University. Prior to joining MDC, he spent about 9 years with the Missouri Department of Transportation as a senior environmental specialist, where he specialized in streams and wetlands. Nate now serves as MDC's Habitat Management Coordinator, where he's responsible for what we call our Comprehensive Conservation Strategy. And that essentially identifies Missouri's conservation priorities regarding the greatest opportunities for sustainable conservation of our fish, forest, and wildlife resources. Nate also coordinates our terrestrial or land-based invasive species management efforts. So again, thanks for joining us, Nate.
Glad to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Danielle's position as the community conservationist for the City of Columbia is a cooperative partnership between MDC and the City of Columbia. The position was created in October of 2016 with the goal of integrating more conservation into city practices. Danielle grew up in the large urban industrial area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her parents taught her and her siblings the value of our natural resources by taking them to the Appalachian Mountains for camping and hunting, rafting, hiking, fishing, and more. Danielle notes that access to nature can sometimes be very limited in urban areas, such as Pittsburgh. So those trips to the Appalachians largely shaped her lifelong passion for our natural resources, and also her work on bringing more nature to the City of Columbia. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences, with Fisheries and Wildlife Sciences, and a minor in Biology from the University of Missouri. She also has a Master of Science degree in Ecology from the University of Manitoba in Canada. Thanks again for joining us, Danielle.
Thanks for having me.
And Sarah is a Missouri native and has a personal and professional passion for birds and birding. As Sarah always says, birds are awesome. As your state ornithologist, she helps conserve birds and their habitats. Sarah received her bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri and her master's degree in Fisheries and Wildlife, also from Mizzou, with a focus on ornithology. She has numerous scientific publications to her credit, and Sarah has held several positions with us here at MDC over the past decade. Now as the state ornithologist, she has led our efforts to create the Great Missouri Birding Trail, which is an excellent online resource for birders and birding. So again, welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Joe. Excited to be here.
And we want to give a warm welcome and a thank you to our webcast participants. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time and interest in this important topic. And remember, you can share your questions for our topic experts through the chat box on the right side of your webcast screen, and we'll answer as many questions as time permits. So here's what we're going to cover today in the Wild Webcast. We're going to talk about location, space, types of wildlife, habitat, plants, bird feeding, the importance of water cover, maintenance, some additional resources, and more. So let's get this conversation going with Nate by talking about location and the considerations involved with that.
Yeah, so it's important to understand where you live in the world and how that can play a role in what wildlife you can attract to your own backyard. We can expect to see different species based on whether you live in a downtown area versus a suburban neighborhood versus a rural setting. So you may expect to see a greater variety of wildlife in a rural area than you would in a downtown scenario in most cases. You also need to consider what habitat may be around you already. Are you next to a park, a stream, a forest, a grassland, or are you next to a parking lot or other homes, or are you surrounded by invasive species? So all of these factors are going to influence either positively or negatively, what wildlife you may or may not be able to attract to your own backyard.
That's good. So location is vital. And another consideration is space. So let's talk about space considerations, Nate.
Yeah, space is important to consider as you're starting to plan out your own backyard habitat. So do you have a lot of room to where you can create a diversity of habitat types, or do you have a smaller area where you might just have to focus on a particular suite of species, such as I want to attract some amphibians and reptiles to my backyard, or I want to attract some pollinators. Some other things to consider for the area that you may want to consider are your physical characteristics, such as your soils. Is your area shaded, or is it in partial or full sun? You know, what's the slope, and which direction does your area face? These characteristics lead to another important characteristic, which is moisture availability. So is it a hot, dry site, or a very wet site, or is it somewhere in between? And that's going to, help you determine kind of what plants or what wildlife you may expect there.
Good to know. Our topic is about attracting backyard wildlife, and there are many kinds of wildlife that we want, but there's probably some we really don't want. So why don't you tell us more about that, Nate?
Yeah, so whenever we create our backyard habitats, we've got a certain idea of what kind of wildlife we expect to see from what we're planting or what we're establishing there, such as most people look for birds, butterflies, bees, other insects, possibly even mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. But at the same time, those same habitat types that we provide for the animals that we want to see can have kind of unintended consequences with species that we don't really want to show up. And those could involve things like raccoons, bears, skunks, possums, armadillos, and maybe venomous species in some cases.
Well, one species of native wildlife that most people really love is the native black bear. And while we might be thrilled to see one in the wild and from a safe distance, we probably really don't want them in our backyards. So how can we prevent that?
Yeah, so black bears are really a wonderful presence in Missouri, and you're right, a lot of people love them. But they can become a nuisance if they become acquainted with humans. Much like raccoons, they're very intelligent, and they're happy to take advantage of an easy meal, which could include food waste from our garbage or possibly our compost. But it could also involve backyard feeders, such as bird feeders. So if you live in bear country, which is primarily in Missouri south of I-44, though they're starting to spread northward a little bit, our biologists recommend only feeding the birds in the winter so as not to attract bears the rest of the year. If you must feed your birds, it's recommended that you put your feeder around 10 feet off the ground, suspended, and then around 4 feet from any structure. So you could, for instance, hang it between two trees or from a building to a tree or something like that. And then at the same time, you want to let your neighbors and your family members who are also in the same area know so that they can reduce any conflict they may have with the same issue.
Okay, that is good to know. Nate, you mentioned composting, and it's great for the garden and landscaping beds, but the food scraps could attract bears. So any suggestions about that?
Yeah, so composting, again, it depends on your situation, how much property you've got. If you have a large property, you could compost on site, but anywhere you are, you're going to want to keep it away from your house. Another thing you can do is not compost food items, which are going to attract bears, so it won't give off the scent of food. If other things fail, you can place an electric fence around your compost pile to try to prevent bears from engaging in that. If those things fail, you may just have to give up composting in general so as not to attract bears. One of the most important things we can do is just for everyone to be bear aware. If you have any issues or concerns, please contact NDC and we'll help you through it.
Great information. So what are some key things we need to know about attracting the wildlife that we do want?
Yeah, so everything I've been talking about is really creating habitat. And what we want is good quality habitat, which you can sum up into three primary factors, which are food, water, and cover, or also known as shelter, which allows our species to live, hide from predators, and also reproduce. So let's talk a little bit about food first. So food, the basic thing we can do is plant native plants. That's a good start. Plants are going to provide seeds, nuts, berries, nectar, and coming with those plants, they're going to attract a lot of insects that rely on those plants. And insects are a basic form of food for other wildlife that we're trying to attract. Another important thing is water source. So animals just like us need a steady water source. So you can include things like bird baths, small ponds, which will not only be a water source for drinking, but also could be a breeding site for your amphibians. If you have a stream nearby, that's also very good. And then the cover aspect, or the shelter. So we can include trees and shrubs if you've got area for that. tall grasses. Dead trees make great habitat, and also if that tree, if you need to take it down or it falls over, you can leave it there if you've got the room and you're allowed to do so, because that down log will actually be habitat itself. You can create rock structures, brush piles, and then Danielle and Sarah are going to talk here a little bit more about nesting boxes a little bit.
Right. And again, with habitat, you mentioned having a number of factors, so you want to keep things diverse.
Yeah, so the greater diversity of habitat you can provide, that's the greater variety of species of wildlife that you can expect to come to that property. So again, those factors of how much room, what kind of habitat you can put in are going to kind of determine what kind of wildlife comes to your yard.
Thanks, Nate. That's some great info. Now let's turn to Danielle and talk a bit about plants for your backyard landscape. So Danielle, when it comes to plants, what should we look for?
Well, when it comes to attracting wildlife to your yard, we need to look at their plant's role in the ecosystem, which is to provide food and shelter for our wildlife. Now, the way we landscape our yards has a profound impact on the wildlife that surrounds us. For example, if we look at the house on the left, we see turf grass, which is a huge monoculture, few flowering plants, and all of them are non-native. So this yard is not adequate, does not provide adequate shelter or food to support wildlife. However, the house on the right shows a high diversity of plants that are native. So if you want wildlife, you need to plant native plants. Native plants are indigenous to Missouri, meaning that they've existed in this location for tens of thousands of years, are adapted to our climate, and have co-evolved with our wildlife, which means that they feed the ecosystem. Now, some plants do that better than others. So according to some research done by Doug Cowley out of Delaware, there are certain native plants that are host to more insects than many other native plants. So if we look at oaks here, like the one in the picture in the bottom right, it supports 500-some moths and butterflies, such as the banded hairstreak. And we see the same relationship in other plants like perennials. So if we look at this list, you see that we have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers, which are food for hundreds of butterflies and moths than most other common native plants. You could technically plant your entire yard with natives and only attract a dozen or so insects if you choose plants that only support a dozen or so insects. Or you could plant native plants like goldenrod, asters, and sunflowers that support hundreds of insects and get a much greater diversity of insects in your yard. So
this is really a great list and pretty extensive. So we see there's a long list of possible plants. Do you have any favorites to share with folks?
I don't. So I do not come up with lists for people about my favorite plants because it all depends on your site and your site's conditions, as well as your conservation goals.
And as Nate mentioned before, you want a diversity within your landscape, so it also sounds like it's a good idea to have diversity within the native plants you choose.
Absolutely.
Well, all right, and native plants you mentioned, support a lot of insects. Let's talk about how those insects then support other wildlife.
Well, just like plants are to insects, insects are to many other wildlife, they're food. And so oftentimes people get upset when they find bugs on their flowers. However, when we're recreating a food chain in our backyard, that's the whole entire goal, is to provide that food for other animals like the American toad, bats, spiders. A lot of the birds that Sarah's going to talk to you about, even the seed-eating birds, require insects for reproduction. So bottom line, when we're creating backyard habitat, our goal is to feed the food chain, starting with the plants and the insects.
Good to know. And an important thing to remember is to plant the right plant in the right place. So why don't you tell us more about that, Danielle?
Yes, so before you start digging, make a plan for your native garden. And that involves looking up, looking around, looking everywhere. If you see power lines, don't plant a tree that's going to grow above 15 feet. Find something that's smaller or find a different spot. Call 1-800-DIG-RIGHT, have them come out and mark your underground utilities. And then take a look at your site conditions. What is your soil like? Is it compact? Is it silty and sandy? This is all going to determine the fertility of your soil as well as the moisture level of your soil. And then take count of where the sun is coming. Is your garden going to be on the southwest side of your house where it's really hot and dry, or is it going to be on the northeast side of your house where it's warmer in the afternoon, or you get that warm sunshine in the morning, but that cool air, so it'll be a cooler microclimate.
All right, well, we encourage people to grow native plants. So tell us about this great resource we have from one of our conservation partners, which is Grow Native, and is located at grownative.org.
Yes, so the first thing I do when I'm coming up with a plant list is I go to the native plant database, and I take my site conditions, and you can put your site conditions in. Right there you see if you have plant type, season, all the different features that you're looking for. And you put that criteria in, and it comes up with a list of plants that meet that criteria.
That is an amazing resource, and again, you can just really filter by your conditions and the things that you're looking for. So now, I love to landscape and garden, and one of my big challenges, I'm sure it's a challenge to many people, is to have flowers and even trees in bloom really throughout the entire growing season. So any tips to share on that, Danielle?
Yeah, so unlike the non-natives that we commonly use in our gardens.
Those annuals that you buy every year.
Exactly, those zinnias and other daisies. Native plants only bloom during a certain time of year. So you want to make sure that you have a handful of species that bloom in the early spring, a handful of species that bloom in the summer, and a handful of species that bloom in the fall. So species like potatoes in the right top corner, which bloom in the early spring. In the top left, we have columbine, which is blooming right now. And then there are other fall asters and goldenrods, like the asters in the bottom left. But by doing this, you're providing a pollen and nectar source for pollinators, so bees, butterflies, etc., throughout the entire growing season.
You mentioned pollinators, and like many people, I want to attract a variety of them, including bees and butterflies. So some more advice on that?
You have to look at your flower structure. So in addition to bloom time, flower structure is also important because it attracts different pollinators. So specifically, hummingbirds look for more tubular flowers like the coral honeysuckle. Ants like flowers that they can crawl into, such as the top center, and then the bergamot beneath that. And then bees and butterflies like a nice landing pad, like the mist flower and the coreopsis on the right side.
That is great. And when we talk about plant selection, the structure is really important also.
Exactly. So we have these prairie plants that we're putting in our yard that grow to 9 feet tall, and they have these huge flower heads. By planting taller grasses next to them, you're providing structure to help those plants hold up their flower heads. And one thing to note is that if you have a garden next to a sidewalk or a road, make sure those taller plants are in the back.
So we don't want them kind of falling over into the sidewalk, and when you put the tall plants in back and kind of cascade shorter plants in front, it helps support those taller plants too.
Mm-hmm.
That is great. So again, you want to plant in groupings, and tell us about floral fidelity.
So some native bees will visit the same species of flower one after the other, and that's what floral fidelity is. So if we plant in groupings, it actually makes it easier for those native bees to forage. And it also provides a more designed or intentional look to your native garden.
So it's also helpful not to just put one plant of a species in, but get several of them and make a grouping. It looks better, and it's better for attracting wildlife. Danielle, you mentioned bees and you mentioned ants before as important pollinators, and flies, not really house flies, but a whole bunch of other different outside native flies are important pollinators too. Some folks aren't real wild about these types of bugs. So can you just touch on how we can more peacefully coexist with them in the garden?
Well, like my mom used to tell me, leave them alone and they'll leave you alone. So, and you can also educate yourself. A lot of times native bees are mistaken, or our native flies that are pollinators are mistaken for bees. And so by having a better understanding of what you're actually looking at, it will give you some comfort in knowing what your surroundings are like. Great advice.
Well, we've talked about types of wildlife we want and the types of plants we could use to attract them. What other things are important in really creating a wildlife-friendly landscape?
So most native bees are solitary and nest in the ground or in dead stems or in trees. So if we look at the picture in the center, you see a ground nesting bee, and these ground nesters, they nest alone in their own hole, but they create their nests on one aggregation. So leaving some soil, bare soil in your garden is a good idea to give those species a place to nest. Monarch caterpillars typically make their chrysalis on a twig or grass, so they leave the milkweed plant. And providing that structure will help them, protect them from parasitoids and other predators. And I think the most important thing is just providing several layers of habitat, your ground flora, your shrub layer, your understory, and your canopy. And that's best if you want to provide as many resources as possible for attracting as many species as possible.
That is great information. And then that one picture on the bottom is what, a bug house, and those are really getting more popular. They're good wildlife habitat, and people also use them kind of as yard art. So tell us about those.
Those little bee hotels are for the mason bees and other bees that will drill into the stems of dead vegetation. So if you can't leave up your native plants throughout the winter time, a great substitute is a bee hotel.
And that's great. You could buy those at retail places, and it's also fun. You can make them yourself. It's a fun family project.
Exactly.
That is great information. So we've talked about wildlife and the nesting sites. Tell us more about water sources and the importance of that.
So water is just as important for insects as it is for other wildlife. And some simple things you can do is to have a bird bath with some perches. And you can use marbles, stones, gravel. They are, people are getting really creative in these water features for butterflies and bees. So it can not only be a functional part of your garden, but also an art piece.
And kind of an important thing, too, to remember is, you know, you have water, but they need a way to access it, kind of a place to perch or land. So
that's what that gravel and those marbles are for.
Excellent advice. Well, thank you, Danielle. You know, some wildlife that most folks just love to see and hear and have in their yards are various kinds of birds. So let's take a minute or two and talk about attracting backyard birds with Sarah. And Sarah, bird feeding is one way to get them. So as our state ornithologist, tell us more.
Sure, Joe. Yeah, millions and millions of people love feeding birds. It's one of the easiest way to see wildlife in your backyard. And for those who don't necessarily like spending a lot of time outdoors, you can put up a feeder and enjoy the birds from inside your home. So it's just a really great gateway for people to experience nature and learn more about wildlife in their backyard. But today we're going to talk about bird feeding and water and cover, a lot of the same things that we've already covered, but we'll focus on birds. So we'll talk a little bit about bird feeding. If you feed different types of food, you can attract different suites of species. So we'll talk about black whale sunflower seed first, which is the most expensive form of bird seed that you can get. And it attracts species like cardinals, titmice, chickadees, a few different types of finches, nuthatches, and even woodpeckers will break open these seeds. A lot of people feed this type of seed, but it is the most expensive kind. So if it's hurting your wallet a little bit, I'd recommend only feeding this type of seed maybe during the winter when the birds need it most.
Good to know. And what about mixed seed? So if you need something a little less expensive, but still good variety.
Yeah, a lot of people feed mixed seed, which is great. It still provides a great food source for those birds. This mixed seed includes sunflower seed as well, but also millet, milo, and other seeds and grains that are just a little cheaper than sunflower. This can attract a lot of the same suite of species as sunflower seeds. But if you're having trouble in an urban area with European starlings draining your feeder and eating a lot of that seed, you might consider switching to only black whale sunflower seed because they have a tougher time breaking open those seed holes like some of the other native birds.
Some good advice. And what about suet? And what is it really? And how do you use it?
So suet is a great bird food for especially woodpeckers, but other species will use it sporadically when they're in need of that high-fat, high-energy source. Suet is made out of rendered beef fat or lard or peanut butter. You can make your own suet using peanut butter or lard with nuts and seeds and good stuff like that mixed in. So yeah, it's really great, mostly for woodpeckers, but a lot of other species will use it.
Thank you, Sarah. And bird feeders are great. They're very popular, but they can be some work. And dirty feeders can cause problems for our feathered friends. So tell us more about that.
Sure. So yeah, feeder maintenance is very important. Feeding birds is kind of a responsibility. You're providing that food source, but you also have to maintain those feeders so that the birds don't get sick. The most common disease that can happen at bird feeders is conjunctivitis, which is like the bird form of human pink eye. And it is caused by an accumulation of droppings in the feeder tray or in seed hole piles underneath the bird feeder. Mold and bacteria can kind of grow in that. And one good thing you can do if you notice birds at your feeder, especially finches, are susceptible to this. If you see
the picture we have here is a finch with this conjunctivitis, and it kind of crusts over the eyes.
Yep, their eyes get kind of crusty, and sometimes it gets so bad that they can't see out of it. They can get better. It's not fatal, but one thing you can do if you notice this, these crusty eyes, is you can take down your feeder for a few weeks. This can spread at a feeder site, and so if you take down your feeder for a week or two, the birds will spread across the landscape and they won't be concentrated in one place at a feeder. If you notice this, you should clean your feeders about once a month anyway, but to do this, you can put your bird feeders right in a dishwasher on a hot setting. You can hand wash them with soap and hot water or a diluted bleach solution, which is 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. And if you use bleach, just let those bird feeders air dry completely to make sure there isn't any bleach residue on there.
All right, so keep your feeders clean and keep our feathered friends healthy.
Yep.
Thank you. So we don't want to skip, as far as feeding birds, the turbocharged tiny titans of the bird world. So do you have some tips on attracting hummingbirds?
I do, yes. So millions of people also like feeding hummingbirds specifically. We get ruby-throated hummingbirds. They're the only nesting hummingbird in the eastern U.S. So they're the most common type we will see around here. Most folks know the recipe for the sugar water that mimics natural nectar, which is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. You boil the water and let it cool. You don't need to add food coloring to that hummingbird food. It does not need to be red. Most hummingbird feeders are red already, and so they'll be attracted to that color. Replace this water every week or two, especially when it's super hot. If you don't have a ton of birds around draining your feeder, make sure to replace it so we don't get things growing in the water. Just make sure it's clean, new water. I'd clean your feeders once a week with hot water and a brush. You don't need to use soap, but if it's real dirty, maybe at the beginning of the year, use that dilute bleach solution and then rinse thoroughly and air dry.
Okay. Well, Sarah, we've been hearing from folks about orioles this time of year raiding hummingbird feeders. So what can folks do about that? And then another thing that's cool is Oreos love grape jam. So tell us about those two things.
Yeah, so if you have a type of hummingbird feeder with open holes in it without the little plastic flowers on them or tubular entrance to the feeder, orioles can come up and just kind of drain their hummingbird feeder. They have returned after thousands of miles during migration, especially right now. People are seeing a lot of orioles. There's many of them coming up to their breeding sites here and farther north. And so they're very hungry and tired after that long migration, and so they just really like that sugar water. So one thing that you can do to keep orioles from draining your hummingbird feeders is to purchase a hummingbird feeder that has the little tubular flower openings on it, or purchase a hummingbird feeder without perches, because Baltimore orioles cannot perch and drink the sugar water, whereas hummingbirds don't need the perch, they can just hover.
All right, interesting. And what's up with the grape jelly?
Oh, yes. So orioles like eating nectar and fruit as natural food sources. So many people put out orange slices and grape jelly. It's just a high sugar, high energy food source that you can give those birds as they've come back from migration.
Kind of just like us, we don't want to eat this high sugar every day, but they're tired, they need some quick energy, so this is a good thing to do this time of year.
Yeah, they need that energy after that long migration.
All right, so well, aside from feeders, what kind of plants can we plant to attract hummingbirds?
Yeah, especially for hummingbirds, these 4 species are really good native plants for those. Danielle mentioned they like that tubular shape, flower shape, and those include some of those here: Virginia bluebells, columbine, royal catchfly, and beard tongue are good options for native plants. Good
to know. Earlier, you just mentioned mealworms. Bluebirds love mealworms, so
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Yeah, there are a few other feed types that I forgot to mention, which is mealworms, specifically for bluebirds. They eat those throughout the season and the nesting season. They'll feed them to their young. You can just put those out in a little dish or bowl if you have bluebirds in the area. You got to watch out, though, because squirrels and other birds will eat those up pretty quickly. You can purchase bird feeders with a little cage around it that has openings only big enough for a bluebird-sized bird to get through. And then thistle you can put out during the winter or migration for small birds that have very small bills to eat seeds, mostly finches or pine siskin.
All right, and mealworms, I mean, folks, we don't typically grow that, but mealworms are readily available to purchase, dried or alive from pet stores and things like that. And you just put some in a bowl or a pie plate or something and put that out.
That's it.
So it's pretty simple. Good to know. Thank you. Sarah, Nate talked a bit earlier about preventing problems with bears and bird feeders. Bird feeders can attract bears. So again, any more information as far as how folks can maybe prevent problems with bird feeders and bears?
Yeah, so if anybody sees any activity with bears on their property and they feed birds, take down your bird feeders immediately. Those bears are long-lived and they have a very good memory. So if they're attracted to that bird feed, they will continue coming back. So if you see bear activity, definitely take down your feeders. If you must feed birds, feed them, don't feed them from April to November if you're in bear country, especially because birds really need that supplemented bird feed during the winter months the most.
That's when bears are sleeping, so
yeah, they're less active.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We've covered food pretty well, but water and shelter are also some basic needs for all of us, including birds. Let's talk about water sources a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Danielle mentioned that insects need this water. Of course, humans need it too, and birds are no exception to that. You know, a lot of people feed birds, but not everyone provides a water source, and this is just as important. And you can attract a lot more birds to your yard if you provide that water source. So it adds a little bit more maintenance because you have to keep it clean. If you just have a bird bath out there without any water movement, it can grow algae pretty quickly, especially in the warm weather. So you'll want to clean that with that bleach solution we talked about fairly often. If you, birds are really attracted to moving water. So they sell water wigglers or little solar units like the photo on the bottom that just kind of create a little fountain and move the water around. And birds can really key in on that moving water. They hear it and just sense it from farther away, and so birds are just way more attracted to it. If you're really hardcore and want to provide a really great intricate water source, this picture on the top right is an underground system of the photo on the left. And so you can create a recycled water feature. Remember to put those good stones on there for birds to perch on, but those tubes underneath there recycle the water, and there's mesh on the top to keep debris from getting in there.
Okay, good to know. So we have food and water, and we also need shelter or cover. So tell us more about that.
Correct. So this can be a sticky one if you have homeowners associations or your neighborhood association or city ordinances that don't allow you to have brush piles or debris like that sitting around. So I would check with those first. However, if you provide cover, it can really, really help your birds because it provides an escape from predators as well as from harsh weather and a little bit of shade when it's really hot. And so creating a brush pile with your yard cast-off waste, you can create a neat little brush pile in it and it won't look too messy. In my house, after we're done with our Christmas tree, we set it underneath our bird feeder for a few months just to provide that extra cover. And if you grow a lot of native plants in your yard, leave that standing vegetation after the growing season. As Danielle mentioned, that provides good boring habitat for a lot of insects, but also it provides great cover and forage still for a lot of bird species when that standing vegetation provides seeds in the fall.
So in addition to kind of some natural cover, some birds really prefer birdhouses. So tell us a bit more about that.
Correct. So some bird species are cavity nesters. Putting up a birdhouse mimics a natural cavity in a tree. So only some species use birdhouses, but the two most popular ones, I think, are purple martins here on the left. They're a colony nesting cavity nester. So a lot of people put up big systems of purple martin houses on the left, and also a lot of people put up eastern bluebird houses. Pay attention if you haven't ever put up birdhouses before where you're placing these birdhouses. Some of them have suggestions and recommendations on where in the landscape, how far away from trees, how high up to put the birdhouse for different species.
great information. So let's focus for a few minutes on why it's so important, again, to use, as Danielle mentioned, to use native plants to attract native wildlife, and here specifically native birds.
Correct. So earlier we saw those tables of species, of native plant species that attract the number of native caterpillars that Danielle showed us before. And this is the same gentleman, Mr. Doug Tallamy of Delaware. He's an entomologist. He studies insects. And he wrote this great book called Bringing Nature Home. And he bought a recreational property in Delaware. And as he was studying this property, being an entomologist, he found on one native oak species, he found 450 caterpillars of 19 different species of moth or butterfly. In contrast, he looked at a Bradford pear on his property, which is an invasive non-native species, and he found one caterpillar on that. So that just kind of further illustrates to us that native caterpillars really need those native plants and just produces a whole lot more food for birds. One really neat anecdote from that book is that he put up a camera on a nest box he had with nesting chickadees in it, and he documented all the species of caterpillar that the birds took into their young. And he counted 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars that it took to raise one brood of chickadees, only 4 to 6 nestlings. So if you take that one nest box, multiply it by the millions of birds that are breeding across the landscape, it just shows you how necessary and vital this food source is to our birds.
Wow, that is a lot of food needed. Okay, so thank you, Sarah. Let's jump ahead now with Danielle, and we've planted our carefully chosen native plants to attract the kinds of wildlife we want. It's all in, so what now? Have some maintenance tips for us?
So first, native plants are known for being low maintenance. However, that only applies after your plants are established. So the first year, your natives are still going to need that tender love and care to get through the hot summer. So I recommend that you plant your native garden in the fall so that by the spring, your plants have already established their roots and are better suited to survive that summer without so much care from you. So secondly, there are native plant landscapes have a reputation for being messy and can sometimes cause issues between you and your neighbors or you and your city. And there are ways to avoid this. One way is to design your habitat garden so that it looks intentional. And you can do this by creating borders, like you see in the photo with the wood fence. That fence also provides nesting habitat for carpenter bees. You can create pathways made of turf, gravel, or dirt between plantings. This gives it a more landscaped appearance. Mm-hmm. And another tip for keeping the peace is to make sure you don't plant things that will grow into the sidewalk or road, and to cut your dead vegetation in the spring.
So kind of that picture in the upper right, your plants are growing into the sidewalk, people that might not want to appreciate that.
Exactly. And then another factoid is that native plants can be mulched. They just like a light mulching. So like the photo in the left bottom corner, that's actually our City Hall monarch garden, and it looks like a very manicured garden. And then lastly, signage helps. It gives what you're doing some credibility. So there are programs through the National Wildlife Federation, Monarch Watch. If you're in the St. Louis area, there's Bring Conservation Home. And if you're in Columbia, we have the Como Wild Yards program.
Cool. Thanks, Danielle. Let's jump back for a moment. You mentioned removing vegetation in the spring. So let's go back to that. Folks, often want to do some fall cleanup by cutting down their tall grasses and their dead flower stalks, and well, birds and some bugs even need those for food and shelter over fall and winter. So let's just emphasize that a little bit more.
Absolutely, it is that winter habitat for them to survive. And so if you can't keep your dead vegetation up, you can cut it to 16 inches, the stem at 16 inches. There's been some research done by Heather Holm that shows that it's still enough stem for them to bore into the stem and overwinter. It's still adequate. It creates perches for wildlife viewing during the winter time, so it benefits you as well. And it also adds texture to your yard.
Good stuff. Good to know. Thank you, Danielle. So let's recap a bit on what things folks need to remember.
Right. So you want to inventory your existing landscapes, identify what wildlife you want to attract, choose the species that are adapted to those specific conditions, talking specifically about plants, and then eliminate any competing vegetation, especially invasive species. Start small, don't get too big, and keep records. It's always good to know what you planted the year before.
Right, what worked well, what maybe didn't work well.
Absolutely.
Good stuff to know. So what are some resources if folks want to get more information?
So a great free resource is grownative.org. Not only do they have plenty of information about native plants, but they also have their resource guide, which gives you a list of native plant retailers and landscape professionals in the native plant field. The Department of Conservation and Grow Native has the publication Native Plants for Your Landscape, How to Attract Them to Watch Wildlife. It's a great free resource to help get you started. I like the Xerxes Society at their website. They have a lot of great free information. I also think their book, Attracting Native Pollinators, is a great way to learn more about those smaller tidbits of information that we don't always think about, like nesting habitats. And if you want to know more about the ecology behind native landscaping, as Sarah said, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Calamy is a great book. And then if you want to know more for implementing native landscaping in your yard, I think Dave Chilka's Native Landscaping for Wildlife and People is a great resource.
All right, now I'm just going to give, again, the shameless plug that if you want to learn more about native plants, native wildlife, and landscaping and for yards large and small, visit mdc.mo.gov. Also, well, thank you, Danielle. And for our webcast participants, what's the most important advice you can give to folks?
Well, you know, you put in all the hard work. Now it's time to get out there and really enjoy it.
Enjoy the fruits of your labor. So thank you again, Nate and Danielle and Sarah. This was pretty fun and informative. Let's get to some questions that our folks want to know. Thank you to our webcast participants. Again, keep sharing your questions. We have a list going here through our chat box on the right side of your webcast screen, and we're going to answer them as we can. Jason wants to know, how do I keep those pesky sparrows out of my bluebird houses?
Yeah, so that's a common issue, Jason, when you put up bluebird houses, is that house sparrows will also use cavities to nest in, and they can be quite aggressive to our native eastern bluebirds. House sparrows are a non-native invasive species, and so you can remove their nesting material from the bluebird box. So if you are positive that house sparrows are nesting in it and using that bluebird box, you can remove their nesting material. You just need to make sure that it's house sparrow nesting material and eggs, which are plain white. And so it is allowable to remove that species, but all the other species in Missouri, besides the European starlings, are protected by federal regulations. So,
okay, so once the native birds start nesting, can't really
correct.
touch the nest.
If a house wren or other native species uses the nest, which they can, yeah, you can't remove that material. But if a house sparrow is, they also sell some traps and exclusions for house sparrows that you can look up online too. So.
Speaking of bluebirds, Steve wants to know, they had 2 bluebirds fledge, and sometimes he understands they'll have a second nesting. Anything folks can do to encourage a second nesting of bluebirds?
Yeah, if you want to clean out your bluebird box after they've done a first clutch, I don't know that I would do that because they'll likely use the same nesting box, and so they can handle that and put in new material. So nope, I would just continue doing what you're doing and providing that good nesting box and habitat for them.
All right, Sarah, since we're talking about some birds and birdhouses and things, Daryl wants to know, he says, we have feeders out and get a lot of birds, but we also have squirrels that are raiding them and even had a raccoon show up. So what do we do to get rid of those critters?
Yes, they can be a nuisance if you're feeding birds. All the other wildlife want to be fed too. So there are certain guards you can put on the post that hold your bird feeder. You can put kind of conical guards on if your bird feeder hangs from a line across the yard. You can purchase squirrel-proof feeders to keep them out, but really it's kind of tough unless you're really, really vigilant to run out and scare them. We have one that climbs in our house-type bird feeder and just sits in there eating all the seeds, so it can be very frustrating.
Oh, it sure can. Let's jump to Danielle. You mentioned as far as native plants and mulch. Well, Helen asked if you need to feed and mulch native plants really as much as you do for those annuals.
Absolutely not. That's one of the key benefits of native plants, is that because they have existed here for tens of thousands of years, they are acclimated to our environment. So there's a plant for hot, dry, and there's a plant for cooler and wetter.
Good to know. And Well, we have you here. Carol wants to know, she lives in an apartment in Springfield and just has a small patio. Will containers work for native plants?
Absolutely. That's what I do at my apartment.
Good to know. While we're on it, Cindy asked if she can mix vegetable plants with her native plants. She loves tomatoes and peppers, but has a small space to grow stuff.
That is a perfect way to merge agriculture and ecology because they work hand in hand. So those pollinators that we talked about, those bees, butterflies, and moths, they all work for you and your garden.
Okay. Danielle, you also mentioned that it's ideal to plant your natives in the fall, which lets them get their root structure down during the cooler months, so by the time the heat of the summer comes, the fall season, they're good. But Carl wants natives, but he hasn't gotten around to it. So is it still okay to plant them now? And if so, a good place to find native plants?
So it's getting late. I would not go past the next week. So
gets a little hot and dry.
Exactly. And my recommendation would be just to wait, to prepare your site until the fall.
Good to know. Let's see. While we're at it, Sarah, Kathy P. wants to know, you talked about suet, and they've hung some suet containers around the yard, and they have woodpeckers, which they love, but they have a log home, and they're having some problems. So, tips on that.
Yeah, if woodpeckers are drumming into your log side or cedar sided home, go ahead and take down your suet to try and not attract as many woodpeckers to the region. I know that that's kind of tough. But in general, it's not recommended to feed suet in a log or cedar-sided home. If you are having issues with woodpeckers, even if you've taken down suet and they're just drumming into your home, this is happening at my parents' home, actually, at the moment, there are some deterrents you can use. If you make noise or put up shiny things near the area where they're trying to drum and peck holes in the house, you can put up like an aluminum pie pan on a string right in the area so that it blows in the wind. With any wildlife damage issue, you have to try a few different things. They sell shiny mylar tapes that you can hang up in the area. If you have old CDs around your house that you no longer listen to, you can hang those on a string in the area, and those just kind of flash light and can kind of spook the birds away from the area.
Okay, good. Well, we have you, Sarah. Linda wants to know, what can she do to attract indigo buntings?
Yeah, indigo buntings are really beautiful, and they've just arrived in the past few weeks or so. Indigo buntings are great because they're fairly common, but they kind of are an edge species that won't readily use very, very urbanized locations. So I'm not sure, Linda, if you're in a very urban area or more rural, but they're generally found in more rural areas along edges. So if you provide great native shrubs, they nest in shrubs, they like thick kind of shrubby areas along edges of woods. That's what you could do if you have the space to do that.
All right, we're going to have Nate jump in here. Bill W. wrote that he absolutely loves monarch butterflies. As a matter of fact, he's one of the many Missourians for monarchs. So he wants to know more and wants other folks to know, how can he attract monarchs to his backyard?
Yeah, the great thing about the monarch is it's an iconic species, and lots of people can identify the monarch while it's flying around. Some things to do to attract it, monarchs are going to be attracted to a variety of native plants. One of the most important plant species or genuses you can have out there are going to be your milkweeds, and that's basically where they're going to lay their eggs. Then their larvae are going to hatch, and those young, the caterpillars, are going to eat that native milkweed plant until they're ready, as Danielle mentioned earlier, to go into a chrysalis form, which they tend to leave that milkweed and then emerge as a butterfly later. But another important thing around is you can't just have milkweeds. You're going to want to put some other nectar sources around. So there's a variety of native plants that allow you to do that.
Good to know. Danielle, any types come to mind that monarchs love? We know that caterpillars rely on the milkweed, but you talked about plant structures and things for certain type. Would you go back and touch on that again, kind of what monarchs and other butterflies really like?
Yeah, so they like a nice landing pad. So things like coreopsis or sunflowers, those big flowers that provide a nice flat space for them to land and to nectar from.
Good to know. That's something we want to attract to our yards, but another Bill wants to know, fortunately he has a lot of deer eating his native plants. So what are some suggestions to do if deer are eating your natives in your garden?
Yeah, deer are difficult to deal with depending on your situation. You know, the most absolute way to keep them out is to be, you know, to develop a high fence around your native or your vegetable garden, whatever it may be. There's also some kind of over-the-counter sprays and other things you can produce that are produce an odor that will deter deer in many cases. But ultimately, it's going to be difficult to keep them away unless you can really kind of fence off that area with something high enough to keep them out, or an electric fence or something like that.
So essentially some kind of barrier,
right,
or some kind of chemical deterrent or something. I know they sell those, and if you go online, there are some effective homemade recipes for like deer deterrents. So that's good to know. Danielle, let's see, Kelly wanted to know if she should really clear out all the weeds around her native plants.
So weeds, what's a weed? It really depends on what you're considering a weed to be. If your native plants are having a difficult time competing with those other plants, then I say yes, go for it. Otherwise, our natives are pretty resilient, and I just leave mine go.
Okay, good to know. Let's jump to Sarah. Glenn wants to know, so they have feeders up. He says, we have plenty of birds in the backyard at our feeders, but we also have a hawk hanging around that gets some. We don't want to hurt the hawk, but we want to protect our little friends.
Yeah, so this can be an issue. So right now, Cooper's hawks are the most likely species to be around. Sharp-shins too in the winter, but they don't breed here. And so I generally tell the public, I hear about this a lot, and I generally like to tell the public that hawks are birds too and they have to eat, but that doesn't satisfy a lot of people because they're still picking off some of their birds. You know, a lot of these hawks, they don't stick around for very long, about a week or so, and then they move on to the next place. Some stay longer if they have a nest nearby. If a Cooper's has a nest nearby, they can stick around for a little longer. One thing you can do is to provide cover nearby your bird feeder, which is where a lot of these hawks hang out to take birds from your feeder. So again, we talked about brush piles or native shrubs. Provide some of that cover nearby so they have a place to escape if there is a hawk camped out for a few days. Good
advice. We're going to jump over to Nate. Nate, thanks about the information on milkweed. Roberta wants to know, well, how big of an actual area do you have to have for milkweeds to help monarchs?
Well, that's the beauty of native plants, and really, as you mentioned earlier, you can have something as small as plants come in little pots on your balcony, so it doesn't require a lot of area. Again, a single milkweed plant can provide enough habitat for that caterpillar to grow into an adult form. But again, you kind of want to add some other nectar sources around to go with that milkweed, because they'll probably defoliate that plant and eat it up pretty good. So you want some other plants around to feed on.
Okay, and that's good to know. So native milkweed are important. A couple other things, there are varieties of native milkweed. Again, you talked about location and environment, habitat. So depending on where you live, that's good to know the type of milkweed that you might want to plant. You can do big fields, small plants, small plots, potted plants. It's just a great variety, backyards large or small. Thank you, folks. And to our participants here, I want to thank you so far for some great questions. Keep them coming. We have time for a few more questions over a few more minutes or so. So again, while you share some more questions with us, I just want to remind you and thank our experts, Nate, Danielle, and Sarah. So please share them through the comment box, and we will take them as we can.
One thing, Joe, that I want to mention, a question that I get really often in the fall especially, is where did all the birds go? And so while you're feeding birds especially, you know, people get really into it and they expect to see different species all the time. But in the fall especially, that's when a lot of native plants especially are producing seeds. And fruits also, and there's just an abundance of natural food sources, and the birds are really moving around the landscape. You know, any bird feed that we provide for birds, they don't necessarily require. We're just kind of trying to help them out and supplement their natural food sources a little bit. So if all your birds have seemed to disappear, they're just moving around the landscape, eating a lot of good natural foods out there.
Thank you, Sarah. And Danielle, you talked about native plants and how the fact that they're native makes them so much more hardy and resilient and lower maintenance. Amy wants to know, would you recommend or need to water native plants even daily or weekly? I mean, how do you need to water native plants if you do, and how often?
It really depends on the weather. So if we're in a drought, I water once every 2 weeks, once a week, really depending on how much rain we've had and what your soil type is like.
Right, and I'd also remind Amy and others, we have these experts here. I love to garden and landscape with natives. One of the nice things is they are perennials, so they come back every year, and give them a few years, because that first year they're going to focus a lot on root development, and you'll get some flowers, but after the second, third year, you're really going to see them come into their full glory and just be kind of amazing. So the trade-off is you buy annuals every year, they flower a lot, but they're not native. Your natives, one-time investment, and then it just keeps getting better. And one of the nicest things, we need to divide native plants, some of them, every few years or so, so you get free plants, and you get to share with your neighbors and turn them on to planting with natives. Let's see, we have Roberta also wants to know, talk some different milkweeds. Are there different kinds or sizes of milkweeds, with some being better for containers than others?
So I have aquatic milkweed in my container, as well as butterfly milkweed, and I wouldn't necessarily put common milkweed or marsh milkweed, those taller ones, but those species have worked for me.
Good to know. Good to know. Again, folks, thank you for some great questions. Our hour is about up, so I just want to thank, again, Nate, Danielle, and Sarah. Great information. Great to have you here, so thank you again.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thanks, Joe.
Great, thank you.
And we want to thank you, to our Wild Webcast participants. We really appreciate your time and your interest and your questions on this really fun and informative topic. And if you want to know more, we have some more fun coming up. So we're going to add a couple of Facebook Live sessions to our mix here. You can join us simply on Facebook on July 18th, and you could ask Conservation Department Director Sarah Parker-Pauley some questions. She'll be available for about 30 minutes to ask those on Facebook Live. Simply go to our Facebook Live, or our Facebook page, and post your questions as comments. And then also join us on October 31st, where we will have a couple conservation agents available on Facebook Live to ask questions about regulations and all kinds of other stuff. So please join us. And also join us for our next MDC Wild Webcast. It's a while from now, but that's on December 5th. We will talk about eagles and the ever-popular Eagle Days in Missouri. And if you want to watch this and other Wild Webcasts from the past, you can visit us and watch those on our website at mdc.mo.gov. So that pretty much wraps up our Wild Webcast again, folks. Thank you for joining us. Get outside, discover nature, improve your backyards with native plants to attract native wildlife.
Birds are awesome.
Birds are awesome. Native plants rule. Have a great day.